Billionaire never wanted a family, until his one-night affair showed up with his newborn baby boy. The knock on the door came at 3 in the morning, and it would be the knock that shattered everything Damian Cole thought he knew about his own life. He almost didn't answer it. Damian Cole did not get late-night visitors. He was the kind of man whose penthouse floor required a private elevator code, whose calendar was managed down to the minute, whose heart, according to every woman who had ever tried and failed to reach it, was locked behind steel and glass. But something about the sound, frantic, desperate, unrelenting, pulled him out of bed. When he opened the door, he found a woman he barely recognized, her face pale and streaked with tears, and in her arms, wrapped in a thin blue blanket, a baby. "His name is Noah," she said, her voice cracking. "He's yours. If you believe every child deserves love, and every heart, no matter how guarded, deserves a second chance, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Share this story with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2 so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's continue. Damian stood frozen in the doorway, the cold air from the hallway wrapping around his bare feet, his mind refusing to process what was happening. The woman was Elena Marsh, a name and a face that belonged to a single night 8 months ago. A night at a charity gala in Chicago where he had let his guard down for the first time in years, where a bottle of wine and a stranger's laughter had made him forget, just for a few hours, that he was supposed to be untouchable. He remembered her leaving before sunrise. He remembered thinking he would never see her again, and being relieved by that thought, because relationships were complications he had sworn off since childhood, since the day his own father had walked out of his mother's life without so much as a note. Now here she was, gaunt and trembling, pushing a bundle of blankets into his unwilling arms. "I have stage 4 cancer, Damian," she whispered. "I found out 3 months after he was born. The doctors say I don't have much time left. There's no one else. My parents are gone. I have no siblings. Noah has no one but you." Her hands shook as she adjusted the blanket around the baby's tiny face, a face that, even in the dim hallway light, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Damian's own jawline, his own eyes. Damian's first instinct was denial, not of the child's parentage. The resemblance was too cruel, too exact for that, but denial of the entire situation crashing into his carefully constructed world. He had spent 15 years building an empire from nothing, clawing his way out of a broken home in Detroit, promising himself that he would never let anyone depend on him, the way his mother had depended on a man who abandoned her. Family, to Damian, was not a blessing. It was a liability, a wound that never fully closed. He built skyscrapers instead of homes, boardrooms instead of nurseries, and he had convinced himself over years of solitude that this trade had been worth it. But Elena did not wait for his answer. She kissed the baby's forehead, whispered something Damian couldn't hear, and by the time he looked up from the child's face, she was already stepping back into the elevator, tears streaming down her cheeks, refusing to look at him again. "Please," she said, just before the doors closed. "Just love him the way no one ever loved you." The elevator doors shut, and Damian Cole, billionaire, self-made titan of industry, stood alone in his penthouse hallway at 3 in the morning holding a baby he didn't know how to hold, listening to a silence that had never felt so loud. For the first week, Damian barely slept. He hired a night nurse, then fired her after 2 days because the sound of Noah crying through the baby monitor kept waking something in him that he couldn't explain, a mixture of guilt and helplessness that no financial empire had prepared him for. He tried to bury himself in work, taking calls at odd hours, flying to Singapore for a deal that could have waited a month. Anything to avoid the small, fragile creature sleeping in the nursery his assistant had hastily assembled. He told himself this was temporary, that he would find a permanent solution, perhaps a trusted family, perhaps his sister-in-law who had always wanted children, anyone who could take this responsibility off his hands before it consumed him the way love had once consumed and then destroyed his mother. But every time he tried to hand Noah off to someone else, something stopped him. It happened first with his housekeeper, Marta, a warm-hearted woman who had worked for him for over a decade and who looked at him with quiet disappointment when he asked her to look into adoption agencies. "You already love him," she told him bluntly. "You just don't know it yet. I've seen you check on him 4 times a night when you think no one's watching." Damien denied it fiercely, insisting he was simply making sure the nurse was doing her job. But Marta only shook her head and returned to folding tiny onesies that had begun arriving in cardboard boxes he didn't remember ordering. 3 weeks after Noah's arrival, Damien received a call that stopped him cold. Elena had passed away in a modest hospice outside Chicago. She had been alone at the end, save for a hospital chaplain and a nurse who held her hand as she slipped away. Damien flew out immediately, though he told himself it was only to handle logistics, to arrange a proper burial for the mother of his son, nothing more. But standing at her graveside in the rain, watching the casket lower into the earth, something inside him cracked open. He thought of her final words in that hallway. "Love him the way no one ever loved you," and for the first time since he was a boy, Damien Cole allowed himself to cry. He returned home that night not as a man fulfilling an obligation, but as a father beginning to understand the weight and the wonder of that word. He went straight to the nursery, dismissed the night nurse for the evening, and sat in the rocking chair beside Noah's crib until dawn, watching the baby's chest rise and fall, memorizing the small sounds he made in his sleep. It was the first night since Noah's arrival that Damien didn't check his phone once. The following months were not easy. Damien's board of directors grew restless as he began delegating more responsibilities, taking fewer international trips, insisting on being home by 6 most evenings, a schedule that would have been unthinkable to him a year prior. Rumors spread through the business world that Damien Cole was losing his edge, that fatherhood had softened the ruthless dealmaker who had once acquired 3 companies in a single fiscal quarter without blinking. His closest business partner, a shrewd man named Victor Alaric, confronted him directly in his office one afternoon, warning him that sentimentality was a weakness that competitors would exploit, that he was risking everything he had built for a child who wasn't even planned. Damien listened to the entire speech in silence, and when Victor finished, he simply said that he had spent his whole life building something to prove he mattered, and only now, holding his son every morning, did he understand what mattering actually meant. Learning to be a father did not come naturally to a man who had never truly had one. Damien fumbled through diaper changes, mispronounced formula measurements, and once accidentally set off every smoke alarm in the penthouse trying to sterilize a bottle. He missed important meetings because Noah had a fever and he refused to leave his side, sitting up all night pressing cool cloths to the baby's forehead, terrified in a way that no hostile takeover or market crash had ever made him. He read parenting books cover to cover at 2 in the morning, called pediatric hotlines over minor rashes, and slowly, without realizing it, began rearranging his entire identity around the small boy, who called him nothing yet but who reached for him instinctively whenever he entered a room. It was during one particular night, when Noah was running a stubborn fever and refused to settle, that Damien found himself pacing his living room floor at 4 in the morning, humming a tune he didn't know he remembered, a lullaby his own mother used to sing before she, too, disappeared into grief and exhaustion after his father left. Somewhere in that quiet, aching hour, holding his son against his chest, Damien realized that he was no longer trying to fix a problem or manage a crisis. He was simply being a father. And for a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding vulnerability, that realization terrified and healed him in equal measure. As Noah grew older, the transformation in Damien became impossible for anyone around him to ignore. The man once famous in financial circles for his icy composure during negotiations began arriving at the office with baby food stains on his cufflinks and a photograph of Noah as his phone's background instead of stock projections. He turned down a lucrative expansion deal in Europe because it would have required him to be away for 2 months during Noah's first birthday. His employees noticed him leaving the office earlier, smiling more, occasionally laughing at something on his phone during otherwise serious meetings. A video Marta had sent of Noah taking his first wobbling steps across the nursery floor. The empire Damien built did not crumble, as Victor had warned it would. If anything, people began to trust him more, sensing in him now a depth and humanity that had been missing before, a man who understood, finally, what it meant to have something worth protecting beyond profit margins. There were still hard days. There were nights when Damien sat alone after putting Noah to bed and grieved for Elena, a woman he barely knew but who had given him the greatest gift of his life at the cost of her own. He kept a photograph of her in Noah's nursery, a small gesture to ensure his son would always know the woman who had loved him enough to trust a stranger with his future. He established a scholarship fund in her name for young mothers facing medical hardship, a quiet tribute that he never publicized, choosing instead to let the gesture exist simply because it was right, not because it would improve his public image. By the time Noah turned 2, Damian Cole was a changed man in every sense that mattered. He still ran his company with sharp precision, still closed deals that made headlines, but now he did it with an anchor, a reason beyond the accumulation of wealth. Every evening, without exception, he came home to a small boy who ran to the door shouting his name. Not Mr. Cole, not Sir, but Dada. And in that single word, Damian found more meaning than he had in 15 years of boardrooms and billion-dollar acquisitions. He often thought back to that night in the hallway, to Elena's trembling hands and her final plea, and he understood now that she hadn't just given him a son. She had given him back a piece of himself he thought he had lost forever, the capacity to love without condition, without fear of abandonment, without the walls he had spent a lifetime constructing. If the story moved you even a little, if you found yourself holding your breath during that hallway scene or blinking back tears at the graveside, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment sharing your own thoughts, and share it with someone in your life who needs a reminder that love can find us in the most unexpected ways. And before we close this chapter, we have a special request. Comment the word Noah below if you believe every child deserves a home filled with love, no matter how they come into this world. Today, Damian Cole is still one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, but those who know him best will tell you that his greatest achievement isn't any building he's constructed or company he's acquired. It's the small boy who falls asleep every night in his arms, the boy who taught a man who never wanted a family that sometimes, the family we never asked for is exactly the one we needed all along. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of Damian's heart reserved only for her, Elena Marsh's final wish had come true. Her son was loved, fiercely and completely, by a father who had finally learned that the greatest deals in life were never signed in boardrooms, but sealed in the quiet, ordinary moments of showing up every single day for someone who needed him.